Trump is up to with Musk and Vance. I've heard some people describe their actions as a coup, some as a fascist takeover. In your Substack, which I recommend to folks, and in The Atlantic, you've described it as regime change. And I'd like to understand, this is a man who was elected. Congress and the courts are going along so far. How is that regime change? What do you mean? And what do you think their goal is here?
So, first of all, to be clear, in modern times, most democracies that fail because a legitimately elected leader assaults the political system. So this is not a new thing. It's not the first time it's happened. It's how Viktor Orban took over Hungary. It's how Erdogan took over Turkey. It's how Chavez took over Venezuela, actually. So it works from the left as well as the right. It's you can do it without any particular political ideology. What it means is that a leader who very often using the language that we've called populism. I don't actually love that word, but it's what we've come to use, meaning a leader who describes himself as the only true leader, like I represent real Americans, or I represent real Hungarians, or I represent the Venezuelan people, as opposed to my opponents who are elites and foreigners and not real Venezuelans. And very often people who use that kind of language then feel they have the right to politicize the institutions of the state. So they can take over institutions that are meant to belong to all of us, like regulatory agencies, which make sure that our drugs are safe or our air is clean. And they take over those things and they make them work for them. So they work for the political party or the leader. And that's called state capture. It's a well-known phenomenon, and very often the purpose of it is to create, instead of an even playing field in democracy where there are different political groups can compete evenly, you create an uneven playing field where one group has access to state resources and can use them in politics, and the other doesn't. And there are no perfect democracies, and to some degree this happens everywhere, and everybody tries to gain an advantage, but when you seek to change the culture of the government and change the nature of the government, then you're doing something different. So what looks to me like what Elon Musk is doing is not looking for efficiency. I mean, if you want to make the government more efficient, you don't randomly fire civil servants. Maybe you're firing the best ones. How do you know? Maybe you're firing the people who actually know what's going on and are making things efficient. So that's not how you would do it. Nor do you randomly abolish whole agencies and then smear their leaders and their programs on your personal social media account that you own. In other words, some of the steps that he's taking look to me not like he's trying to create efficiency. He's certainly not creating transparency. Musk is not transparent about his own interests. A lot of the agencies are agencies that regulate his businesses, for example. Some he's had conflicts with in the past. What he's doing is seeking to shock people, scare people, and change the culture of the federal civil service so that the federal civil service is not composed of people who are, primarily loyal to the Constitution, who work for both Democratic and Republican presidents, who work according to the rule of law, who abide by what Congress tells them to do because they have their instructions from Congress. They are and replacing them instead with people who are loyal to Trump or to his movement, or however that's going to be defined. And that is a kind of regime change. It's changing the nature of the government. And maybe just a 1 second of history, which is
Yes,
that
please.
the U.S. in the 19th century had what is called, they used to call it the spoils system. Elsewhere in the world, it's called a patronage system. So we actually had a civil service. It was much smaller than, of course, but everybody was hired and fired, like the postmasters or whoever were hired by one president and then fired by the next president. It was automatic the whole time. And there was an enormous civil service reform movement led by, among others, Theodore Roosevelt. Because they understood that this was very damaging, that you didn't get good government this way. Instead, you had the postmaster was someone's cousin, not somebody who knew about the mail, right? Or it was someone's great aunt, or it was someone's, some party colleague. And so the idea was to create a civil service that was professional, that was merit-based, and then people were loyal to whoever was the president, and they would nevertheless, carry out the law depending on who that was. And we've had that system for more than a century. It's so ingrained that I think people don't even realize that we have it. Other countries don't have it. I mean, I've lived in countries, I've visited countries where the government doesn't work and civil servants aren't neutral. They are loyal to one, as I said, loyal to one movement. And so what Musk is doing by first by breaking people, by scaring them, by firing them, then later on, and then by demanding demonstrations of loyalty in order to keep them on, he's trying to change that culture. And it's clear to me that that's what he's doing. It's not just him, I should say. Russell Vogt, who's the was the author of Project 2025, which we heard a lot about during the campaign, and then Trump managed to persuade people that he didn't know what it was. He's now the director of the budget, and he is going to be. This is also his program too. Famously, before the election, he was recorded saying that what he hoped to do was to traumatize civil servants. He wants them to feel traumatized so that they're afraid to go to work. And when you change the culture like that, when you change the nature of what it means to work for we're talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Department of the Treasury, or we're talking about things that institutions that do very fundamental things that Americans want. Like we want clean air. We want our food not to be poisoned. We want the drugs that we are prescribed to be safe. All those things that the government does. If those things are politicized and they belong to one party, then we lose. We risk losing, I should say, that kind of neutrality, and that seems to me to be what they're doing.
Let's talk about some historical parallels because I want people to understand it's not merely about political loyalty. There's a kleptocracy element to this in a profound way. I've heard you make reference to the early days of Stalin. And then it's quite evident that there are some parallels to what Viktor Orban is doing, who's been a hero of the conservative right lately, which is to also privatize a lot of the functions and enrich his family and friends. Would you talk a little bit about some of those parallels?
Sure. I think actually Stalin doesn't apply here. I mean, it's true that
Doesn't.
Trump used some Stalinist language during the campaign. And I never could quite work out whether he knew he was doing it or whether someone put it in his speeches. But when you talk about enemies of the people or enemies of the
Right.
state, I mean, that's what it is. That's where it comes from. Um, but the better parallel is Orban. You could talk about Orban. You could talk about Chavez. You could talk about Erdogan. You could talk about Putin. Actually, I mean, Putin. It was more violent in Russia, but there was a version of it there too. What Orban did and what Putin did was to create oligarchs. In other words, to create business people who were kind of worked by osmosis together with politics. So people whose fortunes and whose business careers depended on their relationship with the federal government, and who also had access to federal resources or federal. Sorry, I'm using the word federal in the wrong way. So national resources, and who had access to the state resources and state power. And so so Orban, for example, allowed some friends of his to become very wealthy. He gave them contracts. He made sure they became richer. He enabled them, their wealth, and then they in turn helped him. So they would, for example, buy. He would ask them to buy newspapers, or he would, they would voluntarily purchase newspapers or other kinds of media and then change those media to be pro-government. A version of this happened in Russia as well. The Russian company Gazprom, became a media owner, and then changed the nature of the television owner, changed the nature of television to make it pro-Putin. Some version of this we could see in the U.S. as well. In other words, people who begin to owe their wealth and fortune to Donald Trump. Donald Trump can then ask them for favors. They can, whether it's buy up media properties or use social media or do other things that are useful to him politically. Those then become kind of symbiotic relationships, and that this is when we begin to talk about not. This is when we begin to talk about oligarchy. So it's not, to be clear. Rich people have always been influential in America,
Yeah.
and rich people have always been able to lobby to get the law to be what they want. But what Musk is right now is a little different. We haven't had a person of that kind of wealth who's actually making government decisions even while at the same time controlling his own companies. So that
Mhm.
puts him in a different position, than anybody in the past. I mean, there's a second level which you could describe as kleptocracy, which is when a system like that becomes really profoundly corrupt. And the oligarchs or other business people begin using state resources in illegal or secret ways. They siphon off money. They hide money. They take money out of the system, and they move it around the world. And then you begin to have some political systems that aren't really. You don't even have a normal economy anymore. You have a kleptocracy, and so that's what you would have, for example, in Russia, or for example, in Venezuela, actually, where you have the state has kind of merged with drug dealers and the sort of narco world to become something different. So people are both affiliated with the Venezuelan state and with, drug dealers, and that's how they make their money. And so that the danger would be if this system were to slip into that direction. I mean, the Trump administration has already, just in the last couple of weeks, has made a few really worrying changes. They've lifted some laws passed in the rules that were created in some in the Biden administration, some earlier. One governing foreign bribery, for example. There are restrictions on U.S. companies bribing foreign companies, and this actually was something that always bugged Trump. I think he tried to get rid of it in his first presidential administration. He thought it was unfair that like other people can do bribes and we can't. That's really worrying. Another thing to watch out for is does this administration, maybe together with Congress, reverse some of the efforts to make public finances more transparent? So,
Right.
um, most of us, probably everyone on this call, lives in the real economy where like we pay taxes on our money that we declare, and if we're in a business, we are regulated and we obey the rules. In addition to that, there's another economy. There's a shadow economy where people keep their money offshore, where their money isn't transparent, where they don't pay taxes, they don't obey laws, and they move their money around the world, in secret or in other kinds of clandestine ways, some of which is legal, I should say. And there's been a big effort in the U.S. and the U.K. and other countries in the recently to push back against that and make that money transparent. And so this is one of the things I'm worried about is that the Trump administration will reverse all of that and allow people once again to hide their money in the way that very wealthy people like to do.
And I just want to add something to my audience. A lot of hearing this might be sort of an out of body experience. This is stuff you hear about happening in other countries, not in America and in democracy. And I want to help ground you and remind you that the reason we're having this conversation is because we're already seeing some of these things happen. And I've heard Anne talk about the fact that it's not too late to stop it. It's important to be aware. So we'll talk about that. One thing I've seen, Anne, is already Elon Musk. You said we could get to a place where a businessman is doing corrupt things. Doge, which is run by Musk, despite the White House now saying it isn't, somehow in court they said he doesn't run it or even work for it. Um, Doge has actually fired some of the regulators who have gone after or opened investigations to some of Musk's companies. Already, that seems like a profound conflict of interest that would be considered corrupt if it happened in another country.
So it would be corrupt, if it happened in the last administration.
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
the U.S. has had pretty strict rules about conflict of interest, meaning that if you were a business person and you joined the government, you were supposed to sell any business interest, any stock you had that would somehow affect your job. I think if I'm remembering correctly, and I'll just put a caveat that maybe I'm not remembering correctly, but I seem to remember Rex Tillerson sold a lot of stock before he
Yeah.
became Secretary of State, as a way of demonstrating that he didn't have conflicts of interest. Most government jobs require you to declare conflicts of interest or at least make them transparent. The idea that you would have somebody like Musk making decisions about regulatory agencies that regulate his own companies would have been unacceptable in any recent American administration. So this isn't breaking the Constitution, but it's breaking a norm that we created in Washington to avoid corruption that's been in place certainly for decades. This is a big departure from even from the Trump the first Trump administration, where some of this was began to happen, but again, there were still some people who were trying to obey by or abide by the old traditions and norms, and in some cases laws.
Can we touch briefly on this concept of techno-authoritarianism? I want to give people sort of a concept of what Musk might be going for. And it's not just Musk. We talk about him, but there's Peter Thiel, there's a whole world of tech elites who might imagine a different kind of future. And for people who want to dive deep, they have a guru philosopher, I don't know what you want to call him, a guy named Curtis Yarvin, who has written about an alternate structure for our system here, where we move away from democracy into something closer to techno authoritarianism. What is that?
So he's actually used the word Curtis Yarvin has used the word monarchy. So what they mean is they would like to see the United States run by a kind of CEO. So instead of people voting and instead of Congress influencing decisions, there's just one guy, and he's like the founder of a tech company, and he makes all the decisions. And the idea that this would be possible, or this would be a more efficient way to run the country, has been floating around Silicon Valley for a long time. I mean, it's funny they use the expression techno-authoritarianism like it's some kind of new thing. I mean, actually, it's the oldest thing in the world. I
Right.
mean, I mean, and in a way, of course, I mean, they're appealing to something very deep. There's always been, I mean, the great challenge for democracies has always been that people instinctively say, well, there's all this stuff, and you have to vote, and then you have to discuss, and you have to come to a consensus, and that takes a long time. And shouldn't we just have some guy who cuts through all this stuff and just makes decisions? And that impulse to have that is as old as the Roman Republic. So this was the appeal of Julius Caesar, in the time of the Roman Republic. He's just going to arise, and he's going to get rid of the Senate, and he's going to make decisions and move on. And actually, the founding fathers, when they were writing the American Constitution, were hyper aware of the how the Roman Republic. It's not the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Republic. How the Roman Republic fell, because that's what they read. I mean, they were all that's what people read in those days. They were classic scholars. They knew the story. Cicero, who was a writer in that period, was somebody a lot of people knew. If they didn't know him in his original version, they would know kind of pop versions of him and of Cato. There was a famous play that George Washington put on at Valley Forge that was about Cato. So I mean, these are all figures from that era. So they were aware that democracy could be challenged by a charismatic leader who wanted to do away with all the rules, and that's why our Constitution has weird checks and balances in it. And that's how we got the Electoral College. That's how we got the tripartite system. These were all attempts to prevent exactly that kind of leader from coming to power. I've never heard a good explanation of how a techno-authoritarian monarch would stay in power. What happens when people become unhappy and they want to express their views. It's not a very well thought out thesis, but obviously, it's also something that appeals to very wealthy men who are surrounded by people who suck up to them, who are used to getting their way, and who are used to ruling in their little sphere, in their company, or in their world. The idea that they look down on politicians. Politicians have to answer to the people, and they have to abide by the rules. And here we are in Silicon Valley, move fast and break things. We can break all these rules and do things differently. So they've had the appeal of this. You can see where it comes. I mean, it's very old. This is just the modern version of it. And they now describe it using language that's appealing in particular to to the wealthy men of our era. But you're right that it's not a joke. I mean, it's what they believe. I don't think it's the only, the Trump, the Trump administration has other factions in it. There's also a
Yeah.
Christian nationalist faction who might have different views from the techno-authoritarians, and there's a kind of, I don't know. I feel stupid saying this. I don't know, traditional MAGA. I mean, sort of
I
old
know. It's
fashioned
like, what is the
MAGA.
language?
What's the
I
right
know.
language? I don't know. But, so there's some others out in there too, and some of them might not like Musk, but that's what we have at the moment.
I want to ask you, so one of the theories around the techno authoritarians is that we would stop becoming citizens and become consumers, and we can shop with
Mhm.
our feet. So if you don't like living in Musk's empire, you could go to Teal's. I mean, it's wild. So my question, regarding these you mentioned the Christian nationalists and the techno elite, and that they might ultimately have their missions are not aligned in the end. But I want to ask you about this unholy alliance, because we have seen something similar in Europe where the far right and the tech elite have made common cause against the EU to some extent. And I wonder if you're seeing a parallel between what we're seeing in Europe with this fight with the EU and this unholy alliance between Project 2025 and the tech oligarchs.
So it's a little weirder than that because, of course, tech in Europe. I mean, the most certainly this if we're talking about the big social media
Right.
companies are American. And so the complicated thing in Europe is that you have the phenomenon of American social media companies now. I mean, at least Musk, in the form of Musk. Let's not include everybody, but in the form of Musk, setting their algorithms and even doing public performances in such a way that they enhance or encourage the far right. So Musk has openly backed the far right in the German election, which is in a couple of days. JD Vance has done it. It was more subtle, but that was the implication of the speech he gave in Munich last weekend. Um, Musk has also talked about some other elections. They've talked about the Romanian elections. Some of the UK far right as well. So they have they seem to be promoting those people. Why are they promoting them? I mean, the best explanation, and this more or less gets said out loud by a different time. Vance has said this actually in very clearly, is because they're hoping that these kinds of parties destroy the European Union, which has a lot of regulatory power, which is, in fact, probably the only institution on the planet that can still control or regulate large tech companies, American tech companies, not just in social media, but also, they have anti-monopoly laws, for example, as well as rules about. I mean, their main problem with U.S. social media is that it's so untransparent. I mean, you don't, on particularly now I mean, Twitter, it's kind of obvious now that what you're served is constant far
Bullshit.
right. Yeah. But even if you're on Facebook, which is a lot milder, and it's not clear why you see what you see. You don't really understand the algorithm and what it's serving you. And a lot of what the Europe does have legislation that could force some of those companies to make their algorithms more transparent, to give people control over their data, to give them more choice, or even to remove the algorithms altogether. That's maybe the most radical idea. And of course, the tech companies are desperate to avoid that because this is how they make their money. They make their money by serving people um, you know, emotional, angry material that makes them stay online, longer and makes them look at more ads. I mean, these are, that's part of their business model. So they're anxious to avoid being regulated, and so they've been supporting in the far right as well. And Vance, I think it was last. I don't remember now whether it was before or after the election, but he has said very clearly on one of the podcasts that he used to like to do that Europe better not regulate our companies, or then we'll have to think twice about defending Europe. So he implied that NATO was somehow dependent on not being regulated. So this is a very, very big issue for them, and so their support for the far right is on those grounds. I mean, there is actually no far right party in Europe that is as radical as what Trump is now. I mean, I don't know of a I
Wow.
mean, certainly none that are in politics or in parliaments. I didn't know of any who are, Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, who more or less did what Musk is doing, did this very slowly. He did this takeover of the state, took many years. A lot of it was done legally. He had a constitutional majority, so he could change the constitution, which he did a bunch of times. Um, this idea that you just go into the government and you make yourselves the system administrator of the treasury payment system, and you cut payments for programs that you personally don't like. I don't know of anybody who's done that. I mean, it's a faster and more rapid and much more radical way of asserting power.
I mean,
So
maybe it's a
so
gift because it's so evident, whereas if it happens slowly, you don't notice it quite as much. I
Yeah,
don't.
no, that's true. I mean,
I,
I spent years going to Hungary. I actually wrote a book that I worked in Hungarian archives. I just had a communication with a guy who helped me at that time, who was saying he couldn't stand watching what was happening in the United States because it reminded him of Hungary. He actually left Hungary and moved abroad because he didn't want to live there anymore. He was a kind of translator and researcher who I worked with 10 years ago. And he was saying, and we were reminiscing that in Hungary it was very slow. It was possible along the way to think it might not happen. This is much faster. You're right.
I don't know if that's better or worse, to be honest. I see that, who knows? Our It's a little concerning to see how our institutions are not able to respond to the onslaught. So we see that Congress is quite passive. And this week, a federal unions went to court before a federal judge and asked them to halt the layoffs. These people who are federal workers being fired have contracts. There's a breach of contract, et cetera. And the judge said, I wish I could do something, but this is the wrong venue. You have to take it to the Federal Relations Authority, which has already been gutted by Trump. So the system is broken there. They don't have a place to get recourse until they've suffered the pain. I've interviewed politicians and leaders, business leaders, who say Americans are going to have to feel the pain from broken systems, from all these fired workers not being available to provide vital services, and then we can act because there'll be an outraged uprising. Are you afraid that our democratic institutions can't meet this moment?
So what the thing that for me is the most distressing is there are two things. One is Congress. I mean, I don't think, if we're back to the framers and,
Yeah,
I don't think they imagined that Congress would not protest at an executive who took away congressional power. So in our system, Congress decides what it just determines where how money is spent. And Congress being the more democratic body in the system, more broadly representative and so on. And they decide how money is spent. And that Congress isn't screaming loudly, or at least the Republicans in Congress, sorry, the congressional majority, because the Democrats are. Congress isn't screaming loudly about. It's not even Donald Trump; it's Elon Musk making decisions that should be congressional decisions, and this is really shocking. Um, that U.S. senators who have staffs of 100 people and are elected for 6 years and so on, they aren't able to stand up to this is I don't get it. I mean,
it's
and
Citizens
I think
United. I mean, he has the ability to pay to primary them, and they're
so.
terrified of.
So two things seem to me different. I mean, one is that the that Musk is promising to sponsor their primary. Although for senator who was recently elected, I mean, you've got a long
That's
time
true.
before. I mean, I understand it's more explicable in the House. The other thing I think that maybe most Americans don't understand, I saw it was explained to me on a trip to Tennessee I did a year or two ago. A lot of U.S. politicians are now afraid that if they do something, if they vote against Trump, and Republican politicians, I should say, if they vote against Trump, that they will face the wrath of their constituents. And
Mhm.
some of their constituents are armed. And they will be, people will stand outside their houses and say, we didn't elect you to go to Washington to vote against Donald Trump. And their wives will be threatened or their kids will be threatened or they'll need to have security. And I mean, Mitt Romney in the really excellent book that my colleague Mackay Coppins wrote about him said this quite openly. He said he didn't name names, but he said, I have colleagues in the Senate who say things to me like, well, you can afford to criticize Donald Trump because you're wealthy enough to hire private security, and I'm not. So there is an element of there's political threat that comes from the money, and there's a personal threat. People are afraid that they'll suffer. Their families will suffer if they don't vote the right way. And that's new. I
You
don't think that element existed in U.S. politics. Not in recent, maybe I don't know, before the Civil War, or not in some other era that might have been true, but I don't think it's been true in the last 75 years.
you are a student of Russian history and also sort of a Putin whisperer to some extent, if there's such a thing. Um, what what role do you think Russia might be playing in all this?
You know, I think at this point, I mean, there's a separate conversation to be had about foreign policy,
Right, Ukraine,
and
etc.
Russia's role there.
NATO.
But at this point, the authoritarian narrative that Trump used during the campaign, and there's the techno version and the religious version and the anti-woke version, whatever. A lot of the authoritarian narratives are now, you have to now say that they were jointly created. That Russia, the Russians, began promoting, extremism, promoting, anger about, gay rights or about the role of women, and they began experimenting with some of those ideas a decade ago. What they do now, or what they were doing during the last year, we saw one example. They now mostly boost Americans. So there was the media group in Tennessee. I don't know if you remember the story from last year. There was a media group in Tennessee whose sort of fame, kind of podcasters, and who were making videos, who were making, the kind of far right videos that people like to watch, and some of it was anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian. Some of it was just whatever, anti-trans. I can't remember, all, and the point was is that the Russians did boost them, but they boosted them by, they were a fake investor appeared from nowhere with a kind of weird Armenian name and describing himself as a businessman who wanted to invest, and he paid them a lot of money. It's something like $100,000 per video, which, as you know, is a lot more than you or I would get per video. But the point was is that the Americans were doing it themselves. So the Russians were boosting what the American far right was already doing. So their role in the last few years, I think, has been really amplification. I think they were more important in a creative way, in sort of imagining how, what an anti-democratic narrative would look like, some years ago. And now I think they learned from us. I mean, I think Putin picked up the anti-trans stuff from us. I mean, there was no trans issue in Russia that, I think he got that from U.S. media. He has a weird knowledge of U.S. trivia about U.S. pop culture, that he occasionally comes out with. So he made a comment about something about J.K. Rowling, on Twitter. I was like, how does Putin know J.K. Rowling on Twitter? I mean, do we know whoever is the equivalent of J.K. Rowling, what she's doing on Russian social media? We don't, but he pays a huge amount of attention to these kinds of arguments, especially this kind of culture war inside the United States, and he borrows elements of it when he finds it useful to him. And then looks for people doing it that he can amplify here or in the U.S. and also in Europe, by the way. I mean, the same game goes on in Russia, in France, in Germany, and in Romania, everywhere. So
And just to
they
put a Go
they
ahead.
they they kind of pick people who they think are going to be anti-systemic or anti-establishment or anti-NATO or anti-European, and they boost them.
So I just want to put a point on that to folks watching, that stuff you're seeing on Instagram, on Twitter, X, whatever, wherever you're spending your time on social media, there's a possibility Russia is boosting some of this content right now.
I mean, the point is that, we've got used to the idea that we see anonymous stuff. We don't know where it comes from. It's served to us by an algorithm. We don't know why the algorithm has chosen to show it to us. I mean, it's based on something we looked at. I mean, everybody's had the weird experience of clicking on one thing on Instagram and then seeing it over and over again. I once clicked on it was a travel jacket or something, and now it's always showing me travel
You're like,
jackets that I
why?
want
I don't want the jacket. Yeah.
I don't want it. That's but they do it in politics too. So, something that you've said that you like, they'll show you more of it. And if what you like is, if you've clicked on, a white supremacist video, or you clicked on another kind of video, then you'll see that. And so online, we are really not citizens online. We don't have control of our data. We don't have control of what we're seeing. We don't have a clear idea of why we're seeing it. And it's very important, by the way. I mean, this lack of transparency. This is what one of the things that distinguish autocracies from dictatorships is that autocracies are secretive. Like, Putin, for example, is very rich. We don't know why he's rich or how he's rich. We just somehow know that he's rich. He has all these palaces. Some periodically there's Alexei Navalny did a brilliant piece of investigative reporting on one of them and showed how it was built and what it looked like and so on. They flew a drone over it. This is before he was murdered. There's but we don't know anything about it. We have no idea about his personal life, really, about his kids who are somehow becoming more prominent. We don't know anything. In our system, we know about our presidents. We know who they are. We used until Trump, actually, we always saw their tax forms, or at least for the last several decades. Um, and that transparency is part of what makes democracy possible. We know we are citizens. We know things. We know how our government works. We know where the money goes. We know how, or we should do. And the fact that there is so much more secrecy than there once was, the fact that dark money, so-called dark money, can be used to influence political campaigns, that people can effectively contribute anonymously to political campaigns or to advertising campaigns or to lobbying movements. Which has been building for a long time. This isn't new. It's been this is one of the elements that I think has contributed to democratic decline. I mean, there are ways in which what's happening now is, it's the result of a long series of changes. It's a result of the decline in some ways of Congress. It's the result of growing secrecy. It's the result of, the enormous influence of big money in politics in a way that, there's always been some money in politics, but at a scale that wasn't true before. I hope that if we ever get to a point where we can make some big changes, that we'll understand what some of the roots of this are.
Um, you you've written that what we're describing is not inevitable. It's like not too late to reverse course or
Nothing,
shift.
nothing is inevitable.
So what have you seen in other states and other nations to help reverse course? What can we learn from elsewhere?
So what's really important is that people understand that they have agency. You don't have to just watch it happen. You can contribute to your local politics. People tend to think politics is national politics. It's this kind of reality show, Trump and Kamala, something that's happening like on TV and far away. But actually, there is also a local political world. You have local people who you vote for in your town or your city at the state level. Actually, our state in the U.S. system, state level politicians have a huge amount of power. They decide, they control money, they distribute things, they make decisions about schools and police forces and so on. And so, paying attention to local politics, especially in red states, and where there's been gerrymandering, and there are whole swaths of the state where there are no Democrats left. I mean, remembering that you can help bring some debate and some argument into your local, into what seems like a frozen situation. That's really important. In terms of, the lesson from, I don't want to give Americans lessons from autocratic regimes, because that's not what we are yet. So anyway, but even from regimes that are becoming more illiberal, and I lived in Poland at a time when we also had a very illiberal government, and watched what happened then. It's very important to create coalitions, to bring people together, to find discussion groups or other groups. It's really thinking together and working on joint community projects or joint political projects. Does it help your community or your society, it's a way of coping with this feeling of helplessness. So what autocrats want is, they want you to feel helpless and powerless, like you can't do anything, and they want you to feel a kind of nihilism, like it's all bad and politics is dirty, and I just don't want anything to do with it, and so I'm going to go home and watch TV. This is what you have to fight. So fighting nihilism and fighting the sense that everything is impossible. Remembering that you're a citizen, you have agency, you have action, you can say things, you can do things. This is what's really important right now.
We need to form groups. Yeah.
Groups.
Um, I want to know. I'll let you go in a minute. I want to ask you the opposite question, and this is a really hard question to ask, but people have requested I do this. How do people know when it's time to leave?
Oh, we're not there yet.
Okay.
No, it's time. It's time to leave when they're killing people, and
Okay.
that's not happening. You know, in a way, In Hungary and Venezuela and other countries where you had this gradual decline, I mean, there was no clear moment to leave, and the clear moment only came. I mean, actually, funny enough, I ran into a Venezuelan who I met in Caracas 4 years ago last weekend, and he told me I hadn't realized that he'd left the country, and he left because of violence. I mean, when it became hard for him and his family to be sure that they were safe, and I don't think we're near that yet. You've got a long time before you have to leave. We have a great country. We remain, one of the most prosperous, the most generous, one of the safest places to live in the world. And we have a great political tradition, and we have had great leaders, and we still have some. And we have great people who are describing and explaining what's happening, people like you. And there is no reason to despair.
Okay. Thank you. Last question. I have heard you describe that, say, one of the greatest forms of resistance to fascism is joy. That sounds great, but would you help us feel it? Like, why and what would you advise people do?
I, I mean, again, you're dealing with people who want to take your agency away. They want you to feel overwhelmed. They want you to be helpless. Laugh at them. You know, make fun of them. Um, again, get together with your friends and do a project together. I mean, you're feeling good and feeling happy is a way of fighting back. Actually,
Mm,
there's an F. Scott Fitzgerald quote, which is not really, it's not entirely the same thing, but he says, "Living well is the best revenge."
right.
You know, so live your life and be well and be happy, and don't let them ruin your mood. I say this as somebody. Sometimes my mood gets ruined. I admit it, but the more you can fight back psychologically, the more you'll be able to fight back in other ways.
I love that because part of what I do is try to keep people calm with the news because when you get spun out, you have trauma fatigue, you can't engage. And if having joy is also a political act, you can actually feel like you're doing something by enjoying life right now, doing something that matters.
Yeah,
And you are honestly a national treasure. You're just a gift. Thank you for your voice and for your courage. I would love to do another one of these on foreign policy at some point, but
sure.
you have your life. Okay. Everybody watching, you have to sign up for her Substack. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. See you.